Hi, my name's Frances. I have two metal-on-metal total hip replacement devices. Um, the device I have two of is called the Pinnacle, and that's why I'm kind of following the trial about it's. I'm happy to have you on here singing Rolling Stones, but I think it takes away from my credibility. Just kidding. Anyway, so I'm following the trial, and this was a day I went to court, October 10th, 2017. This is several people who are suing Johnson & Johnson DePuy over what they say this device, the Pinnacle, did to them. So this was one part of that day of testimony. I took 50 pages of notes, and I'm trying to boil it down for you. So in case you're like me, someone who has these hips and has been told for years that they're not problematic and is trying to figure out what to do, I saw the evidence for myself as an attempt to figure out what to do. And frankly, it's not looking good. So 2 more surgeries to get the metal, at least the metal liner replaced, probably the metal liner and the metal ball, because both are made of cobalt chromium, which I am learning in this trial is not good. And it seems like they knew it wasn't good, but they put it on the market anyway. Anyway, back to what actually happened. So on this day, October 10th, 2017, Mark Lanier, the attorney for the plaintiffs, he submits as evidence Exhibit 1691. It's an article on measuring cup position. It was written by Dr. Thomas Schmalzried, who is on the stand at the time, testifying through live video feed. So he wasn't actually there in the courtroom, but I could see him up on a big screen, and he could see Mark Lanier and then what's called an Elmo, which I would call an overhead projector type thing. So you put something on the Elmo and it shows to Thomas Schmalzried. And it also showed to the jurors. So Lanier says, you wrote in the past that measuring cup position, he's talking to Dr. Schmalzried, who was a paid Johnson & Johnson consultant, $30 million he made from Johnson & Johnson related to the sale of devices like these metal-on-metal devices. You wrote in the past that measuring cup position on x-rays is something very important to determining how a metal-on-metal device is doing. Now look at what you say in your disclosure. So when you do a study and you present the findings, you usually write a little disclosure statement, and it says something like this, and this is what actually Dr. Schmalzried wrote in his disclosure on his paper reporting the data from his research. Quote, none of the authors has a financial or proprietary interest in the subject matter of the materials discussed, including but not limited to, and then he goes on and reads more. And then Lanier says, and that your study in which you do not disclose your own financial and proprietary interest was a key piece of evidence in some of the hundreds of lawsuits filed against you regarding the failure of the ASR in those people's bodies. You had a direct financial proprietary interest in whether the x-rays show that the cup position of the cup in a person's body, the hip replacement device cup, so that the cup position will help to tell a surgeon whether the metal-on-metal device might be failing. You don't think it's important to point out that this study about cup position as measured in an x-ray affects your bottom line? Schmalzried says, I completely disagree. Lanier says, this isn't the only time you failed to disclose your financial ties to this matter. Schmalzried says, but this article's not talking about the management of a painful hip. Lanier says, you wrote an article about the management of a painful hip, and you didn't disclose in that you had a direct financial conflict of interest there either. Lanier enters Exhibit 6777 as evidence, and Schmalzried says, I don't know what you're talking about. Exhibit 6777 is a paper written by Dr. Thomas Schmalzried himself. It's called The Painful Hip, Diagnosis and Deliverance. Lanier says, you clearly have a financial interest in the sale of metal-on-metal hips, don't you? Schmalzried says, I do. Lanier says, you clearly have a financial conflict of interest in whether or not metal-on-metal hips were causing adverse tissue reactions. If people quit using the ASR or the Pinnacle, which is the hip I have, 2 of them, these are both metal-on-metal hips, because the metal-on-metal articulation was causing adverse local tissue reactions, you would suffer financially. Now, this paper was from 2012, Lanier says. The metal-on-metal Pinnacle hips are being sold at this point, and you're getting a cut of every one, right? Schmalzried says, I do not get a royalty on some metal on metal devices. Lanier says, if a medical practitioner reads your paper that says metal on metal is not that big of a deal and then keeps on using metal on metal devices, that affects your pocketbook, right? Schmalzried says it could. Lanier then reads the disclosure statement as it was written in this article by Dr. Schmalzried. Quote, disclosure. No benefits in any form have been received or will be received from a commercial party related either directly or indirectly to the subject matter in this paper. Lanier says, you also presented the findings, this paper, to doctors at a professional conference meeting, and you say nothing about your financial conflict of interest. Schmalzried says, because in this paper, I'm talking about the diagnosis of a painful hip. Lanier says, and this article does not say a physician should recommend that his or her patients who have metal on metal hips come back at least yearly to have their blood monitored for high levels of the heavy metals, chromium and cobalt either. You say a large head device, 36 millimeter, needs monitoring, but nothing about the people who have 32 millimeter heads needing to be monitored too. You don't say, bring your patients in. Dr. Tony Nargol is another person who's on and off the stand, sent a letter to all of his metal and metal patients telling them to come in regularly for monitoring of their blood levels for cobalt and chromium. Schmalzried says this article isn't about follow-up. I also sent my metal and metal patients letters telling them to come in for monitoring of their blood. Lanier says, you don't tell anyone how to diagnose or deliver patients from pain. You don't tell surgeons how to tell their metal and metal patients or to tell their metal and metal patients to come in and have a follow-up regularly. And again, this is a paper by Schmalzried, and it was called The Painful Hip, Diagnosis and Deliverance. Lanier says, you had a financial interest in whether patients would be brought in. Presumably, if metal on metal patients were brought in, a greater number of problems might be discovered with the metal on metal devices, and that would then affect the metal on metal sales in which Schmalzried had a financial interest. Again, in the paper, he doesn't disclose this financial conflict of interest. Lanier says also, you got a cut or a percentage of the sales of the jumbo femoral head in 2001, right? Schmalzried says large. Lanier says, you published on that issue and that product, the jumbo femoral head, in 2002 as well. Then Lanier submits Defense Exhibit 4871 as evidence. It's a Schmalzried written article from 2002 called Jumbo Femoral Head for Treatment of Dislocation Following Total Hip Replacement. And Lanier reads the disclosure statement as it was written by Schmalzried. Lanier says, quote, none of the authors have received payments from any of the, and he goes on. And then he turns to Schmalzried and says, but you did get paid for jumbo femoral heads, didn't you? Schmalzried says, I don't know what the definition of jumbo is. Lanier says the average diameter for a jumbo head is 40 to 50 millimeters. What was the size head of the ASR you were getting paid for? You got paid and you didn't disclose that when you did research, and published your studies. Schmalzried says, I made a disclosure that was consistent with the journal principles at the time. I think I made an honest disclosure. Lanier said, you had a financial interest in jumbo femoral heads. Schmalzried said, at the time there were no financial conflicts. Lanier said, look at the disclosure. It doesn't say being paid now. It says you didn't receive payment or a commitment to be paid. You were already under contract with the company that made and sold this product that you were studying. You played hide and seek with the funding. And that's just one little snippet. It's about 5 pages of notes. So basically Lanier is trying to say you did all this research and put it out there that pointed to the fact that metal and metal's fine, and you never disclosed the fact that you were getting paid whenever some metal and metal devices were sold. So I have more from this day of trial, and I'll present it a bit later. Thanks.